We're now going to look at domestication. So what is domestication? Well, basically, it's a situation in which humans control the feeding, the care, and the breeding of animals. By the way, you can also do it with plants, but this course is in animal behavior, so I'm not going to talk about plants, just animals. So you do all these things, and then that will result in changes in morphology or anatomy, appearance, physiology, and behavior.
I'm on to you, kitty, and you're in big trouble.
I think not, baby puppy. It is you who is in trouble.
And as we'll see, you can even select for certain types of behavioral characteristics. Now, we're really dealing with analogous processes here. So natural selection, which we've looked at extensively in other segments, is what happens in evolution. Artificial selection is what happens in domestication. And basically the reason for that is under natural selection, nature selects for adaptive traits. And in artificial selection, that's not what's happening. Humans are selecting for adaptive traits, or I guess a better way of saying that, desirable traits. And natural selection, of course, is very slow. However, artificial selection can be quite fast, sometimes in just a couple generations, maybe not always quite that fast, but that's certainly nothing like natural selection. So what are these traits you're selecting for? Well, typically they come under two broad categories, traits that either have economic value or aesthetic value. And most of the time, it's going to be economic value. But I'll show you some examples of each. So this is a good example of economic value. It is a domestic breed of cow. It's called a Belgian Blue. It weighs a ton or more, which you could probably tell just from looking at this thing.
This cow is technically known as a Belgian Blue, and it's the product of selective breeding.
Selective breeding is the first stop on our tour of how man is using science to control nature. It's used by farmers to enhance desirable characteristics in their animals. In fact, selective breeding is all about managing sex. To create these Belgian Blues, over 100 years, farmers have only allowed the cows and bulls with the greatest muscle mass to mate. And the result is a bull that weighs over a ton. The animal's breeders are keen to show off the results of their hard work. The bulls are shaved to best display their muscles.
What they try to do is to clip the animals in order to highlight all the muscle, you see?
Well, so you can see where all the meat is. That's
Exactly.
But even here, where they've sort of trimmed in there.
Yeah, to highlight that muscle, which has got a high value, you see?
And these are all going to be lean cuts, and they're all for quick cooking, are they?
Yeah, that's right.
Because when you look at this, you can't help thinking of lunch, you know?
Well, even if you could find these in your local supermarket, which you can't, you probably wouldn't be able to afford them. These newer breeds, produce remarkable meat, but it's incredibly expensive. And remarkable in terms of nutritional comparisons, as we see here looking at the Belgian Blue versus an American beef cow. Just look at the difference in calories, fat content in particular, and also cholesterol. So, basically, it's a huge improvement nutritionally over what you would buy in an American supermarket, at least for now. And people have selected for all kinds of things like a furless cat. So it's not that they didn't shave this cat, even though Gillette uses this in a commercial. No, it's not a shaved cat. It's been bred for having no fur. And also featherless chickens. We used to have some of those at the University of Connecticut. Maybe we still do. I don't know. I haven't seen them. But Nevertheless, that is something that's been selected for. The feathers have not been plucked, they've not been shaved or anything like that. It never had feathers to begin with. So, when you're dealing with domestic animals, especially in terms of economic value, we're talking about a big industry. And if we just look at the poultry industry, for example, you have these huge hatcheries with incredibly large incubators. In my own research, I had an incubator that held 500 eggs, and that was huge. I mean, these things hold, I don't know. I can't even estimate how many hundreds, if not thousands, of eggs you'll find inside a commercial incubator. By the way, they're being turned every so often because that's what a hen does on a nest to keep the embryo from sticking to the inner shell membrane. So that's why it's important to turn the eggs. You just don't let them sit. And then in about 20, 21 days, you go and look, and there you have some birds starting to hatch. And they're all wet and goopy, but they fluff out in a couple hours or so, and then they look cute. And then you put them on a conveyor belt like this. Now again, this does not hurt the birds. If you recall from another segment, we looked at a wood duck that's jumping 60 feet off the ground and hitting solid ground. These birds are very, very light. Now, what she's doing here is vaccinating them. It happens very quickly. It's a very quick process, but it's just making sure that you're not going to end up buying a diseased chicken. And then they're sent to these farms where they'll be grown out until they get large enough to end up in the supermarket or at KFC or wherever. So it's a huge, huge commercial industry. And in fact, you look at how things have improved over the past half century, a little bit more than that. If we look at the size of the strains of the meat breeds of chickens, because there's also egg breeds of chickens, the meat breed is, you're selectively breeding for animals with more muscle mass, like the Belgian blue cow, for example, only now in chickens. Back in 1957, so that's the chick on day one, 28 days old, and then 56 days old when they would be ready to be slaughtered for market. 1957, and then a huge jump in 1978, and then in 2005, even bigger. These are just side views over here of the same birds that we see over here. So again, people are selecting for these various traits. You just allow the birds that have more muscle mass to breed, and those are the ones that will end up looking like what we see here. Now, Charles Darwin was really interested in domestication to the point where he wrote a 2-volume set called The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication in 1896. And this was really a seminal work. I mean, he covered so many things about domestication. Of course, it included plants as well. He even wrote some papers on orchids, which are domestic plants. And if we look at this book, focusing on the animal part of it at least, we see some drawings from that book. He was very interested in pigeons because of the way you could select for very, very different traits. I mean, if you look at the fantail, and what you're selecting for there is obviously that fanned out tail, almost peacock-like. The powder pigeon over on the right. It's these are interesting anatomical traits that have been selected for. And if you go to his house, which is a museum, you can walk through there in the village of Down, which is on the outskirts of London. You'll even see these pigeons there. I took that photograph when I was there, and pigeon fanciers have been very popular in Great Britain, and that goes way back to certainly when Darwin was doing his writings. And so it was very convenient for him to get information about the various domestic breeds of pigeons. Okay, here's a morphological example. This is a Japanese breed of rooster, and it's quite obvious what was selected for here. It's the very, very long tail, measures out about 6 feet, if I'm not mistaken. There's some other individuals there. This has no economic value. So this is an example of selectively breeding for an aesthetic trait. Not that people necessarily find that aesthetic, but whatever. It's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, the idea here is you're selecting for some trait, and then you can exhibit these birds at like a fair and see if you win the blue ribbon or something like that. Morphological examples. And of course, we see this in dogs all the time. I mean, you don't eat dogs. Well, certainly not in this country. I know that it's done elsewhere sometimes, but not in the United States. And but you can select for all kinds of varieties of dogs in terms of size and shapes and all kinds of characteristics, including my dog over here. That's Luna, short for lunatic, actually. Okay. Here's where you can select for a specific behavior. This is a classic experiment done by psychologists back in the 1940s. I don't know, a long time ago. Maybe not quite that long ago. But anyway, there's a maze. Now, the way to run a maze is you have a place to start, and then you have a place you got to end up. But, how many mistakes are you going to make along the way? If you start here and go there, you've made an error. Okay, you can correct that and back up and go here. But if you go there, you're making another error. Okay, you can correct that. So you can count the number of errors that you make while running a maze. These are humans running a maze. This is a Hampton Court maze. Very popular in the UK, actually. And you'll find some of these things in this country as well. Easy to get lost in those things. Well, this study involves selecting for maze running behavior, not in humans, but in rats. So what they did was to start. Oh, by the way, yeah, you wouldn't do that. That's cheating. So that's not part of the selection study. So here's our parental generation. So you just take some rats they've never been selected for in terms of maze running behavior. You put them in a maze and you count the number of errors they make. And you can see over at the left-hand side of this curve, there are some that are making very few errors. And over on the right-hand side of the curve, there are some that are making a lot of errors. And most of the rats are kind of like making a moderate number of errors kind of in the middle. Okay, so a pretty normal distribution in terms of the number of errors that rats are making. Okay, so again, it's a selection study. Now, the whole purpose of this study was to breed a breed of rat that would make very few errors, and another breed that would make a lot of errors. In other words, you're breeding for two types of maze running behavior, whether rats are bright, making very few errors, or whether rats are dull, they make a lot of errors. And by the way, those are the terms that the experimenters use. They might be politically incorrect today. So you're going to breed those rats among themselves, they make very few errors. And you're going to breed those rats among themselves. They make a lot of errors. And you're not going to do anything with the ones in the middle. Just use them for something else, some other kind of an experiment or whatever. Okay, so we're just focusing on the extremes in this selective breeding experiment. Look what happens after the first generation. Now look at this curve, okay, parental. Look what happens now. It's flattened. And so you continue doing this generation after generation. You run these rats in the maze. You only breed the bright rats among themselves, the dull rats among themselves. Don't do anything with those guys in the middle. By the second generation, you're starting to see a bimodal distribution, two populations, but there's still a lot of overlap, of course. You continue doing this. Breed the bright rats among themselves, the dull rats among themselves. Fifth generation, these curves start to actually spread out even more. By the seventh generation of that breeding, you have almost non-overlapping distributions. In other words, they were successful in creating a strain of bright rats that make very few errors when running the maze, and a strain of dull rats that make a lot of errors when running the maze. So there's our maze bright rats, as they called them, and our maze dull rats, as they called them. Now, interestingly, what you've selected for, maze bright, maze dull, can actually be modulated by experience, specifically the rearing experience of the rats that you have just selected for. So this is a follow-up study that was done by some other researchers. And what they did was to take maze bright rats and rear them in the normal rearing environment, which is typically a cage about this size with 2 rats per cage so that they can have some social experience. And they took some maze dull rats and did the same thing, separate cages, of course. Now, they put some in impoverished environments. So some maize-bright rats go into these small cages, 1 rat per cage. They can't see other rats. They can certainly hear and smell other rats, but there's no social interaction. And again, they do the same with the maize-bright and maize-dull rats are housed like this, the impoverished rearing condition. And then the extreme opposite, the enriched condition, where it's a large cage, there's many other rats in there they can play with and lots of toys that they can climb around and go through. They change the toys every few days so they don't get bored with them. An enriched environment. Here are the results. Now, the normal environment is the same environment that original study was done in. And so when they're run through the maze, you can see that, yes, you get the same kind of separation that you got in the original study as predicted. So you have our maize-dull rats that are making a lot of errors. That would be the brown bar. And the maize-bright rats making fewer errors. That would be the blue bar. Now, what if you're taking these rats and you're rearing them in an impoverished environment? So we already have our maize-bright and our maize-dull strains, right? But now you're going to rear them in an impoverished environment and test them in the maze. They are both doing very poorly. The otherwise bright rats are now behaving exactly at the level of the dull rats raised in a similar environment, in a similar impoverished environment. The bright rats aren't bright anymore. Now, what if you do the opposite and you raise the bright rats and dull rats in an enriched environment? Our dull rats are no longer dull. They're almost at the same level as the bright rats. They're both doing very, very well. So yeah, you can select for these traits, obviously, but you can also modulate them. You can affect them by intervening and rearing them in very bad or very good environments. Obviously, a very good environment would be ideal. Now, Charles Darwin said, "Nothing is more easy than to tame an animal, and few things more difficult than to get it to breed freely under confinement," which is true. I mean, some animals don't take well to captivity. And if they're upset by the surroundings in which they find themselves, because people have put them there, they're not going to be reproducing very well. So it's a tricky process. And it's an important step when considering which species you're going to try to domesticate, and of course why you're going to domesticate them in the first place. Again, it would either be economic or aesthetic value. But then there's the consideration of you got to make it happen somehow. So how domestication occurs goes through several steps. First, there has to be some kind of loose contact between humans and freely breeding non-human organisms. If you never come in contact with one another, then you're never going to get to the next level. So, they have to kind of like be around and tolerate your presence in the natural environment. They're breeding freely among themselves. You've done nothing to them at this point other than to maybe habituate them at least a little bit to your presence. Okay, now if that works, you can then try confining them, getting them to breed in captivity. Basically, you're trying to tame them down. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's going to vary from species to species. Well, if you've gotten that far, now you can really focus on selective breeding, artificial selection for either your desired economic trait or aesthetic trait. And then finally, you get to the actual domestication part where you are having specific economic or aesthetic, but we're going to focus on economic considerations where you are, in fact, creating discrete breeds. A meat breed of chicken versus an egg breed of chicken, a meat breed of duck versus an egg breed of duck. Cattle that have very high muscle mass. And, of course, the extreme being something like a Belgian blue, which has even more muscle mass than the American cows that have been bred for muscle mass. So now we're actually at the domestication stage. Now notice, taming and domestication are not the same thing. You can tame a wild animal, but you've not domesticated it. You don't get to the domestication part until you've actually artificially selected, step 3, and then end up with, step 4, discrete breeds that exhibit those characteristics for which you've selected. That is domestication. Okay, so that's our introduction to domestication, and we'll look in other segments at some topics related to this.